What's happening right now is that people are like, yeah, that happened, but I'm still thankful. I'm still going to eat. I'm still thankful for all of this stuff. And it's like, yeah, and so I feel like using the word Thanksgiving, I think, is like a part of the propaganda. I think it's a part of the messaging that they want to have, existing for hundreds of years. They want us to think like, oh, yes, that happened, but I'm so thankful that that wasn't during my time, or I'm so thankful that wasn't towards my natives. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that those Indians back then, the Wampanoag Nation, they were taken for granted. And every nation after they were taken for granted was taken for granted.
Man, as I was listening to both of you, I was there with you. I was like in the covered wagon going westward, like conquering new land. I hadn't heard it articulated quite like that we've been kind of wrapped into this pride of manifest destiny, and uncovering the truth for real. I think when I think about the biggest misconception for me, it's around the falsehood of this friendly, open, trustful, EJ, you said consensual experience. And I feel like that's one of the biggest misconceptions, because I remember growing up and feeling within myself this kind of cognitive dissonance, because when you are exposed to this story and there's nothing to tie it to today, you'd go from, okay, well, if that was the beginning of this country, and that's when Native people and the white folks from England first had contact with each other, and there's not really any education to fill in the gaps between then and where you are today. You see today's context, and for me as a Native girl, really internalized, wondering, well, what happened between then and now, that there are so many things that are hard within our Native community, and that we're really struggling with. And that kind of cognitive dissonance that happens, it's pretty rampant, because even if you extend out not just the Thanksgiving story, but you extend out the miseducation around Indigenous peoples and the history of this place, and here in Alaska, that continues to be the case. And so it invisibilizes us and what has happened to create today's context. And it's really, really harmful, and continues to be harmful, because it doesn't provide an understanding of the truth, like you said.
Yeah, I think the whole thing is problematic. Thanksgiving. To be honest with you, I think Thanksgiving is like April Fool's. I think that should be the holiday. It's like Thanksgiving is like this big, huge, like elaborate prank that the United States has been playing on us for generations now, and many of us have been fooled for generations now. The biggest difference, of course, is that it's not a harmless prank. It's not a funny prank. This prank, this Thanksgiving April Fool's prank that the United States have been conducting now for many generations is hurtful, it's oppressive, and it's traumatic. And unfortunately, many of us have been fooled by it, and many of us have been suffering because of it for generations.
Thanks, guys.
Such a downer.
I know. But, it's important, and so I think that thankfully we take a lot of humor in the way that we have conversations. So it's funny, because now that we're saying like thankful and everything like that, I'm noticing every single time I'm saying thank you, thankful, kind of like a ding in my head now. Okay, and I think you guys touched on it a little bit, but for me, I really separated myself as a Native person, a Nunivut from Barrow Utqiagvik, growing up there, from Native people in the Northeast, Native people in, the contiguous United States. My whole life, I really didn't connect myself to those Native Americans for whatever reason, but I think there's a level of dissociation that we have because our histories are different and our realities are even very different here. Yeah, exactly. So, and INCSA, the 50th anniversary is coming up, I think, next year. So it's interesting, that we're having this conversation now. But what I wanted to ask you guys is, how is learning about this history of the Wampanoag and, other Native Americans down south, how is that relevant to us here in Alaska?
Yeah, I kind of had the pretty much the same exact experience as Alice, is that I dissociated. I mean, I wouldn't even call it dissociation. I didn't generalize who I am as an Inupiaq woman in connection to being a Native woman across all of North America. I knew that we were different from Indians, and there was actually, my freshman year, there's this guy who was a state trooper's kid. He probably moved there the year before or something. I remember him telling me, he made some kind of comment to me about being an Indian girl, and I said, that's not what I am. I'm Inupiaq. And he was so persistent and so strong, opinionated, that we are the same people. And I was really pissed, but I didn't have the words. I didn't have the experience. I don't think I had the right, systematic support, coming from the school. I didn't know how to tell him. Even though we're indigenous, we're native people to the land, we're different people. I am Inupiaq from the Northwest Arctic region of Alaska. Every single tribe in the lower 48 is different. They're completely, even amongst themselves, even if they have a lot of similarities, they're very different and they're very diverse. And I got caught in that for a second. The question was,
how is
learning about it here in Alaska? Why is it relevant to down there? Because Native people are here, and that's the whole narrative of what Thanksgiving was. There are 12 different Native groups. I'm looking at you to make sure I'm telling the truth. So there's 20 language groups. There's 12 corporations amongst those 20 languages. 229 tribes. So we're very, there's a lot of different natives in Alaska. I think it's a really big percentage for a state even. But I think it's important for people to just acknowledge the Native story, definitely. We shouldn't be erasing Thanksgiving altogether. We should be talking about what this Native story is, and it can be relevant to Alaskans. And, I pretty much became aware of this bigger indigenous global community because I traveled, because I left Alaska. I thought that there's just, Inupiaq in Alaska, but turns out Inuit are halfway across the world, across the Arctic circumpolar. I thought, there's just a lot, natives in Alaska, because I knew our story was so different from lower 48. There's just, this very deep, lack of education in all of us Americans, even the natives, because of how the system is brought up.
Yeah, to follow on that, I love that, because there's Native people here. I think the story of Thanksgiving on a meta level is the story of relations between Indigenous people and colonizers. And so it really is just one example of so many. And as it currently stands, because our kids continue to be mistaught the history of these stories, the burden continues to be on us to re-educate constantly, and it's exhausting. It's completely exhausting to be in a position of having to re-educate, particularly because the way I've been really thinking about it more recently is that as Indigenous people, we're operating under a triple burden at all times. One, seeking out history and knowledge that's not easily made available, because it's not part of the mainstream, it's not part of the norm. to seek out our history. It's treated as if it's a specialized history, not America's history. So seeking it out, and often that history is privileged into higher education institutions or institutions like museums. And so we're actively seeking it out, and then as Indigenous people, reckoning with what we find, because it hits us different to encounter the truth of what has really happened. Because I don't know about you guys, but when I read about some of the harms, well, all of the harms that have been committed on Indigenous people, it's visceral. Like, I feel that hurt in a way that it's like my spirit is crying. And to reckon with the truths that we're encountering because it wasn't made available prior to that. And then on top of that, to be burdened with having to educate others, often in the face of defensiveness, anger, frustration, people treating you like you're the turd in the punch bowl, to always be the one who's like talking about, you know, by the way, this is problematic, and by the way, that's not actually what happened. The trope of the angry native or the angry brown person, that we're having to, on top of all of these things that we're experiencing and working through, to then have to try and make other people understand what has happened as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. Because when we really think about it, you know, Thanksgiving is about hiding history and distorting history to benefit, you know, this national identity, right, and the values of this country. You know, like values of, I don't know, whatever your values are. I don't know, like goodness, exceptionalism, superiority. Those delusions, I call them delusions, really. You know, this country has a delusion. You know, it has like this false belief that it's better than everybody. And so to believe in Thanksgiving, I think, is to buy into those values, into those delusions. And so for us here in Alaska, why is that relevant for us here in Alaska? Is because we as Alaskans, we must make sure that the real history and the true history of Alaska's Indigenous peoples do not get hidden and do not get distorted, to continue benefiting those delusions that this country has been promoting and perpetuating for centuries now. So it's very relevant for us here in Alaska. And as has been mentioned, it's very relevant across the world too, right? There are many other countries around the world who have been colonized, and their histories and their truths have been hidden, have been distorted as well, and their peoples have been miseducated as well. It's relevant to all of us. Thanksgiving is not just some trivial thing, you know, that you know, people accuse us of being oversensitive about. Thanksgiving goes way deeper for many of us across the world.
I think it's a real learning process. You know, especially for me this year, and just working on this film documentary project, is I never really questioned these things. I never really thought twice about them. I was, like I said, I kind of was just brainwashed, really. And I think I forgot where I was going with that.
Brainwashing does that.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a statistic here, and it says in 2015, about 80% of public school teachers were white, and about 51% of students were non-white. What do you find is problematic about? I mean, it kind of sounds silly saying it out loud now that I wrote it down and I'm saying it out loud. What do you think is problematic about that, and what are some solutions?
I was ready. Well, first of all, an 80% is a B. So the Pilgrims have a B currently in the public school system, and we're talking about this history. But It's problematic, and I think